Lightning-Fast. You know, I didn't have a problem with Cloud Neo-Vision or Rain Neo-Vision. It might be a bit boring, but at least it isn't ridiculous. Especially in a game where speed is barely touched upon. Did Zadon have no other titles whatsoever? That'd be like calling this Super Strong Sephiroth. Actually, that's not that bad. Zadon's Trustmaster reward is close. It has a high amount of attack and grants a 30% boost to physical evasion. Furthermore, when it's equipped to anyone named Zadon, it grants him 500 extra attack. His Super Trustmaster reward is I Wanted to Go With You, an ability equipable to certain units that cost 8 Limit Burst Crystals and a lot of MP in order to boost your team's stats and Limit Burst damage while said unit is singing. If anyone forgot what singing does, it essentially locks your unit for the duration of the turn's effect, because they're taking the time to buff your team. On one hand, the buffs are pretty good, as after you cast the ability, it'll first increase your team's stats by 250%, then raise it all the way to 300% on the 6th turn, while gradually raising their limit burst damage up to a whopping 300% at the same time. You know, if it actually included attacks rather than just cutting off right here. On the other hand, not just anyone can use this ability, not that the game is generous enough to tell you who can anyways. If you use the Japanese version as reference, it's limited to units who look like they can sing. This means bards, opera scenes, possible idols, Garden and Zadon. But it doesn't include units like Katy Perry or Ariana Grande, so let me just get you guys some pitchforks. Regardless, most of them aren't exactly impressive enough to replace a dedicated unit unless you really have the leeway. Furthermore, since your unit's stuck buffing for 5 turns, you won't be able to use them while they're singing. It's not a problem if you plan well for it, you just have to keep it in mind. Anyways, active abilities. His offensive abilities chain with Stardust Ray. Speedy evasion deals damage and lets your team evade one attack. We also see some outstanding abilities like Steal and Escape, which automatically put him S tier in my tier list video. Provoke is Provoke, Senses Libra but inflicts damage and lets Zadon evade one attack. Swift Raid deals 1 damage and boosts your team's stats by 230%. Teammates Help Each Other recovers a good amount of your team's MP and fills their Limit Burst gauge by 5 crystals. I Need Everyone's Help grants your team a 150% Bird Killer buff and boosts their Limit Burst gauge fill rate by a nice 150%. True Sacrifice can be used once per battle. It sacrifices Zadon to fully restore your team's HP and MP, and fills their Limit Burst gauge by an incredible amount. Passives. With his Trustmaster reward or Super Trustmaster reward equipped, he gains a small boost to his Limit Burst gauge fill rate, a Guts buff, and stats when dual wielding. He deals increased damage to birds and plants, and has strong bonuses towards his Limit Burst damage. He has a stupendously high level of passive evasion. Look at that! 50% physical and magical evasion. Not only that, but there's 50% passive provoke as well, which makes it really easy to turn Zadon into an evasion provoke tank. He's partial to dual wielding, and has the associated passives to support that playstyle, especially if he's holding a short sword. His normal attack's been changed to chain with Bolting Strike, and it has Steal attached to it, but since he can't triple cast it like the normal Steal, it's pretty much worthless. He does have a passive that increases his chance to steal items, so obviously this man is well deserving of his ranking here. He can also cure status ailments after a battle automatically, which is niche, but the automatic part is pretty nice. Let's look at his Limit Burst. It deals damage and can raise your team's Limit Burst damage by 250%. If you want that full buff, you have to level it up. Time to change forms. His Brave Shift has a 4-turn duration and a hefty 5-turn cooldown. Active abilities. He still chains a Starless Ray. True Stellar Circle 5, someone explained that name, is a brave ability that lets Zadon evade 3 attacks. True Scoop Art deals damage and removes all buffs from an enemy, which is pretty splendid for such an accessible ability. True Mio Twister deals wind damage and lowers the enemy's wind resistance by an impressive 130%. True Tidal Flame deals fire damage and lowers the enemy's fire resistance by another 130%. Passives. He gains more physical Bird Killer, alongside an automatic Limit Burst gauge regen. His normal attack's been changed to chain with Bolting Strike, and fills your team's Limit Burst gauges by a decent amount of each use. His other passives remain about the same. Onto his Limit Burst. It deals damage. Now let's rank Brave abilities. Objection! You see, you actually overlooked something. Or maybe I did, but that was on purpose. Otherwise, I couldn't use this music. More importantly, his Limit Burst might be simple, but it's also rather tenacious. You see, the more you use it, the stronger it gets, raising the modifier by ridiculous amounts, which will only be supplemented by the several Limit Burst damage buffs and killer passives you've no doubt customized Zadon with. So yeah, I guess it deals damage. Anyways, back to Brave abilities. The effects don't change, but the damage of Speedy Evasion and Swift Raid do get stronger. However, True Stellar Circle 5 is an exception, as raising its level will actually lower its MP cost. let's talk about his damage rotation. There are a few problems here with making a realistic rotation, especially when you like to include things like his Super Trustmaster reward. While other units can use it, you want to make sure you're getting enough benefits to take up a whole unit slot. Furthermore, there's the fact that his limit burst cost is pretty outrageous, which is a given because of its potentially high modifier. But that also means you need the equipment to raise his limit burst gauge fill rate, and other units who can help fill his limit burst gauge faster if you want to spam it. You can think along the lines of, say, Warrior of Light Bards, with his Entrust and Wind damage buffs. Of course, you'll probably need more than that if you want to spam his limit burst within that short Brave Shift timeframe to reach its maximum modifier. Regardless, I'll be assuming Zadon's holding his own Super Trustmaster reward for this rotation. On turn 1, cast I Need Help and double cast Swift Raid. Now, you might be thinking, now we sing, right? Nope, since Zadon's limit burst buffs only last for a single turn. If you want to make the most out of it, I recommend you quickly fill his limit burst gauge by, say, triple casting Swift Raid. Once it's filled, switch forms and activate his limit burst. You want to activate his limit burst at least 3 times to reach its final form, which is a pretty tall order for revolving our thinking around just Zadon. Unfortunately, if you can't manage that before his Brave Shift expires, you have to spend 5 turns in his regular form before getting another shot. Once you manage to cast his Brave Shift's limit burst 3 times, you can start singing with his Super Trustmaster reward. However, keep in mind that this occupies Zadon for several turns. With that in mind, you may want to fill his limit burst gauge up for a 4th time so you can let it loose once he's done singing. Regardless, on the 6th turn of singing, he will gain a tremendous 300% full stat buff and a dramatic 300% limit burst damage buff. But since they only last for 1 turn, you'd best hope that his Brave Shift and limit burst is ready to go. So how good is Lightning-Fast Zidane? He's an incredibly potent unit who's rather demanding to use his full potential. As a support, he's not too breathtaking, which is fair since he also boasts a high amount of damage, which balances itself out in a sense. Strong team-wide stat buffs, a limit burst damage buff, a team-wide evasion stack, a niche killer buff, and a limit burst gauge fill rate buff. It's not a bad spread at all. The majority of it isn't essential, unlike triple cast steal, that's a game breaker, but it'll definitely be appreciated. As a damage dealer, his potential is quite impressive and potentially on the higher end of the spectrum if you're willing to take the time to set up. His Imperos are also quite splendid, with the ability to lower the enemy's wind and fire resistance by 130%, though he himself doesn't actually have an imbue to really capitalize on this. If he had the ability to imbue those elements on your team, he'd be an outstanding ally. He also has an on-demand buff removal, and it's pretty strong to boot. Finally, though his limit burst damage capabilities can be tremendous, he's kind of held back by game mechanics. Unfortunately, his Brave Shift has a turn duration, which wouldn't be too bad, but he also has a hefty cooldown, so you really have to figure out a way to fill his chunky limit burst gauge quickly within that time span. That's probably going to require outside assistance, which is a bit ironic considering Zadon himself is also technically a support character. Luckily, with no other consecutive damage modifier in his kit, you shouldn't have to worry about overriding your progress, so worst comes to worst, you can just play the long game. I do have to stress that long part though, especially if you plan to include his Super Trustmaster reward singing. You need to spend some turns ramping up his limit burst damage modifier, and then you have to spend several turns singing on top of that, all for a 1-turn buff you can't really afford to mess up. Taking the Brave Shift turn duration and cooldown into account is another variable that you have to keep in mind. But, more importantly, let's talk about the future. Everyone knows the identity of his biggest contender. Now, I know what you're thinking, but he's also a supporter! And you're right, Sephiroth might be ridiculously powerful, but that's all that's going for him. However, if you're going to play it that way, there's a second unit you might not remember who can rival Zadon's best buffs in support. And there's a chance she might be free. You can check out this video to find out more. However, that's not to say that Zadon is bad. You can't really call a unit who can grant your team a 300% limit burst damage buff among other things bad. Indeed, if it weren't for the fact that we could see the future, Zadon would likely be one of the best units to try to get, with his high level of utility, triple cast steal, and incredible potential for damage. Admittedly, that still holds true today, which is why he remains so highly sought after despite the fact that he's simply not Sephiroth. Thanks for watching, and if you like this video, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below if you plan to summon Lightning-Fast Zidane. Personally, as someone who's never touched Final Fantasy IX, I don't really care, so I'm going to keep on saving. I'm just waiting for Adept Assistant Aerith, terribly tough Tifa, and super strong Sephiroth. That's where my Lapis is going.